She risked prison, her job, and her entire future, not for herself, but for the son of the man who barely even noticed her existence. If I told you that a maid stole a billionaire's money, you'd probably imagine headlines splashed across every major news outlet, right? But what if I told you that this so-called theft wasn't about greed or luxury handbags or some secret hidden debt? What if it was about saving a child's life? That's where the story begins, inside a mansion in Scottsdale, Arizona, where a single decision changed the lives of everyone inside its walls. Denise Holloway had worked in that mansion for nearly a decade. People in the neighborhood hardly noticed her. She was the kind of woman who moved quietly, with her head down, doing her job, and going home to her modest apartment on the east side of town. But on one night in particular, she walked through the Callow Mansion's front gates, knowing she was about to do something that could end her entire life as she knew it. The man she worked for, Richard Callow, was a billionaire. His name carried weight in the real estate world, a man with glass towers in Los Angeles and luxury hotels spread across the Southwest. People spoke his name like he was untouchable, but for all the power and wealth Richard had, his one true weakness was his only son, Ethan. A boy with a thin frame, freckles across his nose, and the kind of smile that could melt away the pressure of even the hardest day. That night, Ethan lay in a hospital bed at Phoenix Children's Hospital, his tiny body covered with wires and monitors. Richard was pacing the floor outside the room, his voice rough and sharp from hours of phone calls. "What do you mean the insurance won't approve it?" he barked into the phone. "Do you understand who I am? This is my son we're talking about." The doctor, a tall man in his 40s named Dr. Kent, approached carefully. "Mr. Callow, the treatment Ethan needs is cutting edge. It isn't approved by every insurer yet. We need payment up front or it won't move forward in time." Richard ended the call and ran a hand over his face. His empire could buy skyscrapers, but in that moment, it couldn't buy him what he needed most: time. Denise was there that night. She wasn't supposed to be, but Richard's assistant had called her in, saying the house was a mess after Richard had rushed to the hospital. She arrived, cleaning supplies in hand, but as she worked, she overheard pieces of conversation from the hallway. She heard the panic, the desperation. She saw Richard slam his phone on the counter, muttering, "I can't get the transfer approved fast enough. God, what if I lose him?" That was when Denise's chest tightened. She thought of her own daughter, Kayla, asleep back in their small apartment. She thought about what it would feel like to watch your child's life slip through your fingers, not because you didn't have the money, but because red tape and timing got in the way. Later that night, Denise stood in the study. The safe was right there. She had dusted it for years, polishing the handles without ever thinking about what lay inside. But now, she wasn't thinking about jewelry or stacks of bills. She was thinking about Ethan's breathing, the sound of the machines, and Richard's breaking voice. Her hands shook as she whispered to herself, "This isn't for me. This is for him." She pressed in the code. She shouldn't have known it, but years of working in the house had given her plenty of chances to notice. The safe clicked open. The glow from the small light inside lit up stacks of cash, envelopes, even a gold watch. Denise grabbed what she needed, shoved it into her bag, and closed the safe. Her heart hammered as she walked out of that mansion. Every step felt like a drumbeat echoing through her chest. She wasn't a thief, she wasn't a criminal, but in that moment, she had stolen in the name of saving the very child who called her Miss Denise whenever she brought him cookies after school. And the real shock wasn't that she took the money. The real shock was what Richard did when he found out. But before we get there, you need to understand who Denise Holloway really was, because that's what makes this story hit harder than anything you'd expect. To understand why Denise Holloway risked everything that night, you have to know the kind of woman she was. Denise wasn't the type to ever ask for handouts. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't even bitter about her circumstances, despite the hard life she carried on her back. Denise grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the oldest of 4 siblings in a 2-bedroom house where her mother worked double shifts at a diner and her father left before she was 10. Responsibility fell on her shoulders fast. She cooked meals, helped with homework, and worked odd jobs as a teenager to keep the lights on. By the time she turned 20, she was used to living for everyone else. That's why, when her daughter Kayla was born, Denise swore she would never let her feel the kind of instability she grew up with. Every extra dollar she earned went into Kayla's school clothes, her lunches, and sometimes just to keep the old car running so she could drive Denise to work and Kayla to daycare. The Callow mansion was supposed to be just a job, a paycheck that kept the bills from piling too high. But over the years, it became something else. Ethan had been just a toddler when Denise first met him. She remembered the first time she held him while Richard was on a business call. His tiny hands clutched her uniform sleeve, and he laughed when she made a silly face. That laugh stuck with her. In the mansion, she wasn't invisible to Ethan. While most adults walked past her like she was part of the furniture, Ethan would always stop and talk. "Miss Denise, can you help me with this puzzle? Miss Denise, do you think Dad will like my drawing?" And when Kayla came along, sometimes Denise would bring her by for an hour if childcare fell through. Ethan would share his toys, the two kids sitting side by side on the big living room rug that probably cost more than Denise's entire apartment rent. That bond mattered. To Ethan, Denise wasn't just the maid. She was the person who remembered his birthday every year, even when his own father forgot because of another overseas deal. She was the one who noticed when he had a fever, when his appetite dipped, when his shoulders slumped after another lonely dinner in a dining room too big for one child. Denise never complained, but she carried her own private worries. Kayla had asthma, and the medical bills had cut deep over the years. Sometimes, she skipped meals just to keep the fridge full for her daughter. She'd never told Richard, never asked for help, because in her mind, it wasn't his problem. She worked, she earned, she endured. But here's the truth. When you live your life constantly doing for others, constantly being the strong one, there comes a moment when you can't ignore someone else's suffering. That night at the hospital, Denise wasn't thinking about right or wrong in the eyes of the law. She was thinking about the boy who always made space for her in his world, even when the adults didn't. Some people might say, well, why didn't she just tell Richard what she planned? Why didn't she ask? The answer is simple. People like Denise don't ask. They don't beg. Pride mixed with survival doesn't leave room for that. And maybe, deep down, she didn't think Richard would believe her motives. Who would believe a maid took money only to spend it on her boss's child? Denise knew the risks. She knew if she was caught, her daughter would lose the little stability they had. But she also knew she wouldn't be able to live with herself if she stood by and did nothing. That's who Denise really was. A woman who gave until there was nothing left. And when life asked her for more, she still found a way to give again. But to see why her decision mattered so much, you have to know the man on the other side of this story, the billionaire father whose world was falling apart even as he tried to hold it together. Richard Callow's life looked perfect from the outside. If you drove past his mansion in Scottsdale, with its tall iron gates, polished marble driveway, and perfectly trimmed hedges, you'd probably think he had it all figured out. To the world, he was the symbol of success. Private jets, magazine covers, and speeches at real estate conferences where people hung on every word. But inside those walls, it was a different story. Richard had built his empire brick by brick, starting from almost nothing. He grew up in Bakersfield, California, in a small house where his father worked construction and his mother cleaned motel rooms. He promised himself as a teenager that he'd never live like that again. He studied hard, got into business school, and worked 20-hour days until his name was stamped on skyscrapers. But along the way, something important slipped through his fingers. Family. His wife, Laura, couldn't take the long nights, the broken promises, or the loneliness of raising Ethan alone. She left when Ethan was 5, moving to Seattle and starting over. Richard tried to soften the blow by showering his son with gifts, trips to Disney World, the newest game systems, a pony for his birthday, but none of it filled the gap of a parent who wasn't there. That's where Denise came in, though Richard barely noticed it at first. She was just the maid, the quiet one dusting bookshelves and polishing the endless glass surfaces. But what he didn't see was how much Ethan leaned on her. While Richard worked late, Denise was the one who sat at the kitchen table with Ethan, helping him with his math homework. While Richard missed school plays, Denise was in the audience, clapping loud enough for 2 parents. There was guilt buried deep in Richard, though he rarely admitted it. Sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet, he'd walk past Ethan's room and see his son asleep, with the nightlight glowing. He'd stand there a moment too long, his chest heavy, knowing that money couldn't buy back time. But the next morning, the phone would ring, another deal would demand his attention, and he'd push the guilt aside like a bill he didn't want to open. That's why the night Ethan collapsed was so jarring. Richard had been in a board meeting in Dallas when the call came through. Ethan was struggling to breathe, his lips turning blue, his chest barely rising. The nanny called 911, and within an hour, Ethan was in critical care. Richard caught the first flight back, but by the time he reached Phoenix Children's, the doctors were already explaining words he never wanted to hear. Rare condition, emergency treatment, payment required upfront. Standing in that sterile hallway, Richard's empire felt useless. He couldn't negotiate with illness. He couldn't buy back the seconds slipping away from his son's life. For the first time, he felt powerless. And this was the moment Denise had walked in on. The billionaire who could bulldoze competitors with a signature, suddenly begging a doctor for more time. What makes this even more complicated is how different Richard and Denise's worlds were, despite the fact that they often breathed the same air under the same roof. To Richard, money was a tool, a weapon, a shield. To Denise, money was survival. Every dollar stretched, every expense weighed. Where Richard saw millions, Denise saw groceries, rent, and asthma medication for Kayla. And yet, their lives collided over the one thing they shared, Ethan, a child whose laughter had filled both their hearts in different ways. That night, Richard didn't notice Denise standing quietly in the hallway, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes darting toward Ethan's room. He was too busy arguing with insurance agents and bankers. But Denise noticed him. She saw the cracks in the armor, the fear behind the sharp voice. She saw a man who loved his son, but didn't know how to save him. But fear wasn't just sitting in Richard's chest that night. It was about to push Denise into a choice that no one could have predicted. The hospital was bright, sterile, and loud in the worst kind of way. Machines beeping, footsteps rushing, voices clipped and tense. Ethan lay in the bed, his little body too still for a boy who was usually bouncing around with endless questions. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to whisper, "Dad?" before closing again, as if the effort drained everything he had. Richard pulled a chair close and grabbed his son's hand. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here. You just hold on, okay?" His voice cracked, something no business partner had ever heard from him before. Denise stood a few feet back, clutching her bag against her chest. She shouldn't have been there. She was just the maid. But no one had the heart to push her out. Nurses and doctors walked in and out, whispering terms Denise didn't understand. Organ failure, experimental, time-sensitive. Finally, Dr. Kent spoke clearly. "Mr. Callow, the treatment is available in Los Angeles. A specialized team can perform it. But..." He paused, glancing at the chart. "We'll need authorization immediately. The transfer requires private transportation, and the upfront cost is significant." "How significant?" Richard demanded. "500,000. Richard didn't flinch at the number. He'd spent more than that on a single car. But the problem wasn't the amount. It was the logistics. His funds were tied up in deals, approvals, accounts overseas. He needed clearance, signatures, confirmations. Even with his power, it wasn't instant. And Ethan didn't have hours to wait. Richard slammed his hand on the counter. "Get it started. I'll handle the money." The doctor's voice softened. "We can't move forward without the transfer in hand." "I'm sorry." Richard turned away, gripping his temples, his breath sharp. For the first time in his life, his wealth felt like a cage instead of freedom. Denise watched all of this, her stomach churning. She thought about Kayla's asthma attacks, the time she'd prayed for the inhaler to work faster, the fear that clawed at her when her daughter's breaths came too shallow. Multiply that by 10, and that was Richard now, helpless in front of his son. A nurse came in and adjusted Ethan's IV. "We'll do everything we can to keep him stable, but time is critical." Richard's eyes watered, though he turned his face away from the staff. He didn't want witnesses to his breaking, but Denise saw it. She always saw the things people tried to hide. Then Ethan stirred, his voice weak. "Miss Denise?" She rushed to his side. "I'm here, sweet boy. Am I going to be okay?" His small hand reached toward hers. Denise swallowed hard. "Yes, Ethan, you're going to be okay." She didn't know if it was true, but she couldn't let him feel fear on top of pain. Richard looked up at her then, eyes red, his jaw clenched. For a second, they weren't boss and employee. They were just two adults, terrified of losing the same child. But reality snapped back quick. Richard's phone buzzed again. He barked into it. "Yes, I said push it through now. I don't care what form you need signed." His voice carried frustration, but underneath was panic. Denise stepped back into the hall, pressing her hand to her chest. Her mind raced. 500,000. She knew where that kind of money was, in the mansion, in the safe she dusted weekly. To Richard, it was just paper stacked in neat piles. To Ethan, it was life. She thought about how many times she had ignored temptation, walking past that safe, knowing she'd never take what wasn't hers. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the stakes weren't luxury or greed. They were about keeping a child alive. She whispered to herself, if this were Kayla, what would I want someone to do? The answer was clear, even though it terrified her. But making the choice in her head was one thing. Actually walking back into that mansion, opening that safe, and taking what wasn't hers, that was another story. The drive back to the mansion felt endless, though in reality, it was only 20 minutes. Denise's old sedan rattled along the quiet Scottsdale streets, headlights cutting through the darkness. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned pale. Every red light felt like a test. Turn back or keep going. Each time she pressed harder on the gas. When she pulled into the long driveway, the mansion loomed above her, glowing with outdoor lights like a silent judge. She parked near the side entrance, the one staff used, and sat in the car for a moment. Her chest heaved, her mind screaming at her to stop. This was insane. She had never even stolen a piece of candy from a store as a kid, and now she was about to rob her employer of $500,000. But then she pictured Ethan, his weak smile, his question, "Am I going to be okay?" And she knew turning back wasn't an option. Inside, the house was still. Denise's footsteps echoed faintly against the polished tile floor. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. The click of her keys, the creak of the study door. She closed it softly behind her and faced the safe. She'd memorized the code years ago without meaning to. Richard's carelessness was something she often shook her head at. He'd open the safe while on calls, rattling off numbers out loud as if no one else was there. She had never repeated them, never thought she'd need them, until tonight. Her hands trembled as she pressed the buttons. 197524. A small beep followed each press. The lock clicked. She froze, listening, but the mansion remained silent. When she pulled the heavy door open, the sight nearly knocked the breath out of her. Neat stacks of bills, envelopes sealed and labeled, jewelry boxes lined with velvet, even documents she didn't dare touch. For a moment, the sheer weight of what she was about to do nearly crushed her. She whispered, almost like a prayer, "This isn't mine. I don't want it. This is for Ethan." Her fingers hovered before finally grabbing stack after stack, shoving the money into a canvas bag she'd stuffed under her coat. The bag grew heavy quickly. She could feel the weight pulling on her shoulder, both literally and morally. Just as she zipped it shut, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She jumped, nearly dropping the bag. It was a text from the nanny. "Ethan's getting worse. They need to move him soon." Denise pressed a hand over her mouth, forcing herself not to cry. She didn't have the luxury of breaking down. She closed the safe, spun the dial, and turned off the light. Walking back through the halls, she half expected Richard himself to appear out of nowhere, demanding to know what she'd done. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last. When she reached her car, she tossed the bag onto the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. Her breath came fast, shallow, as though the house itself might call the police on her. She turned the key, the engine sputtered to life, and she drove away, the mansion shrinking in her rearview mirror. Back at the hospital, she walked in with the bag held close. The receptionist raised her eyebrows as Denise hurried forward. I need to pay for a transfer for Ethan Callow." The woman at the desk blinked. "Are you family?" Denise hesitated. "No, but please, he needs this treatment. I have the money." It took explaining, paperwork, frantic calls, and more questions than she had answers for. But eventually, the cash was counted, verified, and green-lit. The medical team prepared for transport. When Richard returned from another failed call, he was stunned to see doctors wheeling Ethan toward a helicopter. "What's happening?" he shouted. "Payment cleared," a nurse replied briskly. Richard's brows furrowed. "What do you mean? I haven't—" He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes darted to Denise, who stood against the wall, chest rising and falling fast, her coat still damp with sweat. For the first time, he seemed to piece it together. His gaze flicked from her face to the helicopter lifting his son away. But instead of gratitude, Richard's first reaction wasn't what anyone would have expected. The hospital corridor was buzzing with hurried footsteps and clipped instructions as Ethan's helicopter lifted off into the night sky. Denise stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had done it. Ethan was on his way to the treatment he needed, but the moment Richard's eyes locked on hers, she knew this was only the beginning. Richard stormed across the hall, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "What did you do?" Denise swallowed hard, clutching the strap of her bag even though it was empty now. I made sure Ethan could get the treatment." His face tightened. "With what money, Denise? Don't play games with me." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "With yours." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then his jaw clenched, and his words came like thunder. "You stole from me?" "I saved your son," she said quickly, her voice trembling, but steady enough to hold. "I wasn't going to stand there and watch him die while the bank took its sweet time." Richard took a step closer, his hands fisting at his sides. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That was my money. You could go to prison for this." Her eyes burned, but she didn't back down. "Then send me there, but at least your boy has a chance to live." A nurse rushed past, nearly bumping into them, and Richard moved back a step, his breathing uneven. He looked at her like she was a stranger, not the woman who had practically helped raise his son. Hours later, Richard sat in the waiting room, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Denise sat a few chairs away, her hands clasped together so tight they ached. Neither of them spoke, but the weight between them was unbearable. Finally, Richard broke the silence. His voice was quieter this time, tired. "Why would you risk everything for him?" Denise turned her head slowly. "Because he's not just your son, Richard. He's a child I've cared for almost his whole life. He trusts me. He looks at me like I matter. I couldn't live with myself if I stood by and did nothing." Richard studied her, his expression unreadable. "You could have asked me. You could have told me what you were planning." She shook her head. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have called security before I finished the sentence?" That struck him. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. He wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she wasn't wrong. The hours stretched on. When news finally came from Los Angeles, Dr. Kent returned with a call on speaker. Ethan's surgery had begun, and the odds were promising. Relief washed over Richard, but it was mixed with a storm of emotions, gratitude, guilt, and anger twisting together like barbed wire. When Denise stood to leave, Richard's voice stopped her. "Where are you going?" "Home. I'll face whatever comes next." Richard frowned. "You really think I'm going to let this slide?" Her throat tightened. "I don't expect you to, but I'd do it again if it meant saving him." For a long moment, Richard just stared at her. His entire career had been built on contracts, rules, and order. Theft was theft. There were consequences. But standing there, he wasn't looking at an employee anymore. He was looking at the woman who had stepped into the fire for his son when he couldn't. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Richard called his lawyer. Denise sat in her apartment, Kayla coloring quietly at the table when the phone rang. Her stomach dropped as she answered. "Denise Holloway?" a voice asked. "Yes," she said, bracing herself. "This is Thomas Briggs, Mr. Callow's attorney. He wants to meet with you, today." Denise's legs weakened, but she forced herself upright. She kissed Kayla's forehead and whispered, "I'll be back." But when she walked into that meeting, what Richard decided to do left everyone speechless. The law office was cold, all glass walls and polished wood. Denise sat in a chair across from Richard, her hands folded in her lap. Thomas Briggs, his lawyer, shuffled papers on the desk. Denise expected the worst: charges, court dates, the possibility of losing everything she had fought for. Richard's face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her. Finally, he leaned forward. "Do you understand what you did?" "Yes," Denise replied, her voice steady even though her heart pounded. "I stole from you." $500,000, Richard said, his tone flat. She nodded. "And I'd do it again if it meant saving Ethan." The lawyer cleared his throat, ready to launch into legal jargon, but Richard held up a hand. "You risked prison. You risked losing your daughter. Why?" Denise blinked, fighting the sting in her eyes. "Because when I saw Ethan struggling to breathe, I didn't see your money or your name. I saw a child I love like my own. I couldn't let him die while I stood by with clean hands." Silence hung heavy in the room. Richard's jaw worked as if he were grinding down words he couldn't quite say. Finally, he let out a long breath. "You're right. You did save him." Denise's lips parted slightly. She hadn't expected that. Richard turned to his lawyer. Thomas, drop everything. There won't be charges. The lawyer frowned. Richard, with respect, this is highly irregular. She broke the law. I said drop it. Richard's voice cut like steel. What she did wasn't theft. It was an act of sacrifice. And if anyone should be ashamed, it's me, for being so trapped in my own world that I couldn't save my son when he needed me most. Thomas hesitated, then nodded, sliding the papers back into his folder. Richard looked back at Denise. You'll never know what this means to me. And you're right. I wouldn't have believed you if you'd asked. That's on me, not you. Tears threatened at the corners of Denise's eyes, but she held them back. I wasn't trying to make you feel guilty. I just, couldn't do nothing. Richard leaned back, his expression softening for the first time. From this day forward, you're not just an employee in my house. You're family. And when Ethan's better, I want him to know who really saved his life. Denise shook her head, stunned. Richard, you don't owe me anything. But he leaned closer. I do. And I'm going to make sure you and Kayla never have to worry again. Weeks later, Ethan returned from Los Angeles. The surgery had worked. His body was healing, his energy slowly returning. When he ran into Denise's arms in the mansion's living room, Richard stood back and watched with tears in his eyes. Ethan whispered, Miss Denise, Dad told me what you did. You saved me. Denise hugged him tighter, her voice breaking. You just focus on getting strong, okay? From that day forward, things changed. Richard didn't just throw money at his problems anymore. He spent more time at home, sitting beside Ethan, listening to his stories, and he never again looked at Denise as just the maid. She was the woman who had shown him that love, not money, was the greatest currency of all. The story of Denise Holloway spread quietly through whispers among the staff, then neighbors, then beyond. People were shocked, not by the so-called theft, but by Richard's response. A billionaire who could have crushed her with a single call had chosen mercy, gratitude, and even humility. The moral was clear. Sometimes the greatest risks are the ones that redefine who we are. Denise acted not out of selfishness, but out of love. And Richard learned that wealth means nothing without the courage to put people first. So let this story remind you, when life puts you in a position to choose between fear and compassion, choose compassion. It might cost you, it might change you, but it will always mean something in the end. If you took something from this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And ask yourself, when the chance comes, would you have the courage to do what Denise did?